Hi, Jake Williams here from Rendition Infosec. I wanted to do a follow-up to my earlier piece today on the efail vulnerability. I wanted to talk specifically not so much about the vulnerability, but about the disclosure. I think it's worth pointing out a couple of things here about the disclosure. I've since talked to a couple of different folks in the press who were contacted about the vulnerability prior to full disclosure earlier today. Some of these folks, or a couple of these folks, wrote stories or were asked to write stories about the vulnerability. Unfortunately, due to the embargo, they couldn't supply full details and get into some of the nuance that would help readers really understand the scope of the vulnerabilities. I think this is important to discuss because this embargo practice is not uncommon in our industry. And when these embargoes occur, basically the idea is that the vulnerability researchers turn over full details to the press, but specifically tell these technical reporters what they can and cannot speak about prior to the full disclosure of the vulnerability. Right. So what we have in this case is we have the researchers turn this over, and even if the reporters fully understand what they're doing, again, they're very limited in what they can discuss. I think this is important because initially, then that lacks a lot of the nuance that we rely on to make good, solid decisions. Right? The reporters that I talked to generally defended, the idea of writing these stories, and I actually don't disagree with that. This definitely is an early warning of something that's something that's important to discuss. These vulnerabilities in PGP, collectively known PGP and SMIME, collectively known as efail. A couple of things that I'll highlight. There was some discussion that maybe other file types besides these HTML embedded emails might be vulnerable. I think that's highly unlikely. There was some thought that maybe if cipher block chaining was used, specific bit flips could be used to exploit active content in a Word document or a PDF or something along those lines. I've heard some rumors about that, from a couple of different sources today. I think that's highly unlikely and much less likely than what we saw initially with with the active content in the HTML. A lot of that owes itself to the much more complex formats and formatting of a Word document or PDF, particularly as we get into the XML file types and XLSM, etc., that would contain a macro. Again, that specifically is really difficult to get into because you may or may not know those are actually zip files, right? So you'd be modifying the contents of a zip file somehow that would still decompress. I don't see that as as a likely attack vector. Regardless, I think it's going to be patched across any major client before anybody gets there. One reporter mentioned to me, hey, do you realize that they really were just advising that people disable, not PGP, but disable the plugins that automatically are, let's say, decrypting your PGP-enabled messages, in an automatic fashion, like an in-browser plugin, like an Igmail or something like that. Yeah, okay, I got it. Again, a lot of the nuance that we lost in this, came out of, again, that embargo scenario. I think it's also worth mentioning that again, whether you saw the message to disable PGP, say PHP, disable PHP too, but PGP, because whether you saw that message, whether that was a third-party message or whatever, meaning like you saw it down the road, not necessarily from the original researchers. Totally understand that, totally get it. That said, whether they said it or not, I'm there. That's ultimately the message that was communicated to a number of our clients. And again, I think it's a lot like playing the telephone game, right? Even if the researchers acted completely responsibly, there is some, and let me be clear that I don't necessarily think they did. I think they were working to hype a vulnerability. But even if they acted completely responsibly, what we do know is that, their messages were definitely misinterpreted or blown out of proportion down the line. Now, again, I blame them a little bit for that because they were ultimately trying to hype the vulnerability, and then the vulnerability, as it gets further hyped, no surprise, that it gets blown out of proportion. So, a couple of things to mention here, right? One is we in the InfoSec community have a limited number of fire drills that we can perform with our corporate clients with our corporations, however you prefer to see this. Of course, I always look at things from a consultant perspective, but even if you work in-house, at a particular organization, ultimately the organization IT effectively is your customer, right? So the organization is the customer of the InfoSec shop. I like that model. I like to think about it that way because really it stops an us versus them thing. It's a customer service field, right? IT security really is serving the needs of the customer because at the end of the day, we're a cost center, not a profit center. Right? So regardless here, your constituents, whoever it is that you are beholden to in InfoSec, we have a limited number of fire drills that we can perform in any period of time, on an annual basis, let's say. And I would say that this is one of those, this accounts for one of those fire drills. Some folks like to use the analogy of a limited number of bullets to fire out of that gun. Look, today we used one of those bullets. And the reality is here, a lot of media that our executives and director level folks consume, mentioned efail today. And so as a result, again, I think this is something that we are unfortunately going to be dealing with, quite a bit in the fallout from that. Unfortunately, simultaneously as we talk about this, there are two, vulnerabilities being actively exploited in the wild that were just patched with the Patch Tuesday patches. Right? So if I was going to fire a bullet out of that, fire drill gun, again, it's going to be about patch now. On maybe accelerate your patching of Patch Tuesday. Let's say you're on normally a 30 to 60 day patch cycle, knowing that there are vulnerabilities being exploited actively in the wild from that would change my priorities. And again, this is not something I can elevate easily today. So I would, because of efail. One of the things that I would mention then is, from a responsible reporting, and please don't think that I'm tackling the press here. I would just mention that, from a responsible reporting standpoint, again, I know everybody likes to chase the clicks, everybody likes the hype, totally awesome. And of course, the attackers actively exploiting these vulnerabilities in the wild don't want the media attention. Right? So they're not actively hyping this, right? So again, I don't blame the media specifically for chasing the hype, right? Because again, they were pitched the story. No attackers out there were pitching you stories about like, hey, well, let you know, we're exploiting some stuff that just got patched last week. They don't want the media attention, right? So if we're interested in security, right? If you're an InfoSec reporter and you're interested in security, again, take a look at maybe some of these stories, maybe not necessarily what's being pitched to you, by researchers, although that is important, right? In many cases, but maybe take a look at, where we can do the most good as a community, right? So with that, I'll kind of close out there. But on the responsible disclosure side, look, you find a vulnerability. I know we all want some hype here. Maybe get some third parties to look at it. Don't overhype your vulnerabilities. It's actually hurting our industry, and it'll hurt your. Honestly, it's going to hurt you in the long run to do so. Right? So anyway, I'll kind of close out there. Appreciate your time. Jake Williams from Rendition Infosec, signing off.